Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Factually Speaking, a program in which we bring you discussions on topics of national interest. And this time around, we have with us once again Professor Vanus James of the beautiful island of Tobago, part of the Twin Island state of Trinidad and Tobago. And he will be here along with McCarthy Marie, who's also the co-host of this program, to discuss the contribution of cultural industries to Caribbean economies. And we'll be using as the basis of our discussion three studies which were done, on copyright-based industries. Two of them were done by Dr. James on copyright-based industries' contribution to the island of Trinidad and Tobago, or the Twin Island state of Trinidad and Tobago, and also the Eastern Caribbean countries. He also mentioned, too, that he's already done a study on Jamaica as well. So we're bringing you information from a whole broad, if you will, survey or study of the contribution of copyright-based industries, in the Caribbean, as well as the study which was done by McCarthy Marie on the World Creole Music Festival in 2016. It is called Value for Money. And so we'll be using information from those studies to inform our discussion on the topic of the contribution of cultural industries on Caribbean economies. We want to begin by welcoming Dr. James.
Thanks a lot for inviting me, you and Mac. Let me welcome you to the Caribbean space south of the island of Dominica.
Okay, well, I have to say that I've had the pleasure of visiting Tobago. And I had a very pleasant time in Tobago, very beautiful little island, So I'm looking forward to going back there again. And hopefully you'll be around as well, and so we can hook up,
Definitely.
All right. So let's begin by looking at a sort of synopsis of the studies that you did in the Caribbean. What, from your perspective, has come out of the stories and those studies in a general sense?
Well, the main story that I think comes out of all of these studies is that these industries, those protected by copyright, industrial designs, trademarks, and so on, these are important industries for us, and they're much more important than industries like agriculture. Agriculture would be contributing 2-3% of our GDPs nowadays. But these are industries that contribute all the way up to 7-8% of our output. And they have a characteristic that we should not underestimate. These are creative in the sense that pretty much every year they produce new outputs, new music, new art, new expressions of innovative ideas that represent the way we really ought to engage the world. And Mark knows a lot about that because he lives with one of the great contributors to our capacity to innovate in the whole Caribbean. So we need to pay attention to that, because if you want to make your way, if you want to develop your economies, you have to be giving adequate attention, investing adequately in your capacity to innovate. And that's what these industries do. So there is no underestimating their importance. They also dramatize the critical significance of talent, knowledge and skills and learning. The speed of learning is the most important variable affecting the development of any society. And these guys who are involved in this set of industries dramatize the importance of continuous learning, which is the basis on which they are doing all of this creativity and innovation.
You've already highlighted the contribution of those industries, the GDP of any country, of the countries, that you've studied. Your report also mentions employment, as one of the significant, areas as far as cultural or copyright-based industries, are concerned. Let's talk a little about that.
And I'm hinting at there, these are skill-intensive industries. The people, I mean, there's a lot of labor in them, but they are not notorious simply for the fact that they use a lot of labor. They are critically important because they employ a lot of the knowledge and skills of our people, albeit in the areas in which they take the information and kind of carve out new stuff from the culture, the popular culture, the traditions of our people, and so on. But they don't simply copy the culture. They innovate with the cultural information. So that business of intensive use of knowledge and skills is just as characteristic of these industries as is characteristic of cell phone production. They use science and other things like that, knowledge of quantum mechanics in order to make their cell phones. But our people are using deep insight, deep knowledge, deep understanding of music and the things that make people feel at home and kind of in resonance with nature and so on. We understand that very well all across the African diaspora and maybe all across the world. And our people are not second rate in that at all. The Caribbean is one of the talent hubs of the world, and we have established that in my work in WIPO.
I know Mark has been doing a lot of work in the area of copyright in Dominica and some other parts of the Caribbean as well. And he has had a tremendous challenge in getting people to understand copyright and to understand the significance of the copyright industry and the importance of recognizing the need, to adhere to copyright laws and so on. How would you explain copyright, right? Because we're talking now about your studies on copyright-based industries. But you did mention music, but most people in Dominica, for example, when they hear copyright, they immediately associated with music. But we know there's much more to copyright-based industries than just music. Can you explain to us what copyright is in the context of the reports of the studies that you did?
Yeah, and let me before I even try to do that, let me tell you that Mac has been a pioneer in the study of these industries. I met him in the industry when I came in. He'd been trying to protect certainly the work of his wife and other people around the Eastern Caribbean when ECHO was the CMO driving the industry and so on. So Mac's been a real pioneer in this, and the country needs to listen to what he has to say, and not just Dominica, the whole Caribbean needs to pay a lot of attention to what he has to say. What copyright is all about is that it's a set of legal provisions that protect a particular form of property. All property is protected by law. But the forms of property that amount to what we think of as original creations of the mind, original expressions of creations of the mind, thought, books, artistic work, music and theater, film, video, all of those kinds of things. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have a special category we call the works of mass, which really protect the creations of the carnival industry and so on. But anything that you could cook up in your mind and then give an original expression to, in these broad areas that I have listed here, computer programs, speeches, articles, paintings, architectural stuff, photographs, all those will be protected by copyright. And that's a right that you get once you do the creation, once you do the expression. You don't have to go anywhere, register anything. Once you are the innovator, you have the right. And the point I was making earlier to you is that it's an important set of economic rights corresponding to a matching set of what Mark will tell you would be a set of moral rights, the rights to be recognized as the creator of the expression, the innovator in that particular area. And these are important things. There, just like you own land and you have a right to that, you can own intellectual property, and that's a huge source of revenue if you know how to exploit it.
Okay, we'll get back to you, Dr. James, because I want to specifically or you to speak specifically to those industries you recognize, as having potential in the Caribbean. But I think this is a good point to bring in Mark as the copyright expert here to add his take to this aspect of the discussion.
Well, I think you asked Dr. James a question there at the beginning as to why the Caribbean seems to be so resistant to the whole idea of copyright and intellectual property generally. And I think that has to do with our colonial process that we've gone through. But the colonial process essentially said you needed to be a colony, but you're going to be civilized by those who were civilized. With the result that to a certain extent, we internalized that view with the idea that we cannot invent anything. Therefore, patent has nothing to do with us. We don't write books. Therefore, what point of copyright for us? Yes? So we never took it upon ourselves to think that we do these things and they have value for us. It was always thought of as somebody else's thing which we imported and used. Yes, like Vanus would tell you, we are now creating a copyright protected work. Yes, most people would think, well, we just simply are talking. Indeed, we are talking, but the talk we're doing there is producing a copyright protected work. That just as if what CNN is doing is protected by copyright. Ours is protected by copyright as well. And therefore, we have to understand that.
And we're talking about this program, eh? So people
this particular program,
podcast,
Factually Speaking, right, and all the others we've done, they are protected by copyright, which means that people can't simply use them as they want to. And therefore, we can monetize them in different ways to generate revenue for ourselves and for people we work with, etc. But our problem has been we've been attached and very attached to material, visible things because coming from a, if you like, lack of a better word, oppressed colonial situation, our immediate need was for food and clothes rather than might say esoteric things like culture and books and so on, which we assumed would come from abroad and they would always be better. Yeah, so therefore the idea that we could produce things that would be protected by copyright or by other intellectual property seemed to us a nonsensical idea. It's now, relatively recently, that we've begun to realize that indeed that value in intellectual property, including copyright, is a very significant portion of the GDP of the world. And that's why in our first program...
Do you have any figures on that? The contribution to the GDP of the world?
Not off the top of my head, but I know that most developed countries, the contribution of copyright-based industries to their economies is at least 11%.
Okay, we know from what Dr. James has told us, it's about 8% of,
just copyright,
countries that he studied.
Just copyright.
Copyright, yes.
If you add the other intellectual properties, matter of fact, the European Union every year does a study on the contribution of intellectual property intensive industries' contribution to their economies. And it's always from like 40% of their economies are dependent on industries that use intellectual property intensively. And in the European Union, the intellectual property that actually is more valuable, produces most value for them is actually trademarks. If we are producing works of the mind, which are intangible, they have value, we can sell them to other persons. And then we can use the money to buy material things, chairs and food and cars and so on, right? So those people who produce these kinds of properties there are worthy of protection. And just to give you an example, the person in Dominica who had the most money up till now to get for the use of a photograph was a photographer, of course. He would have made, if he had pursued the thing correctly, millions, seriously, millions of dollars right here in Dominica, not selling it to anybody abroad. just for use in Dominica. He was, yeah. So that would be part of the GDP of Dominica. Yes, which is what Vanus and I, when we do these studies, we are trying to count up all these contributions from all these activities. Music, of course, as you said, is the one that everybody seems to be most interested in and more associate with copyright rather than other activities. But music is just one of those.
Okay.
Data you asked Mac for there, because
Yes, certainly.
it's an
Thank
important piece of data. Just in the US economy alone, copyright-based industries account for about $2 trillion US, just the US alone.
Okay, thank you, Dr. James. Now, I was going to say we're going to get back to you with the question I have in mind, but while I have Mac's attention, I'd like him to, and you can chip in too, to explain the difference between a trademark and the copyright, a copyright. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, a trademark is a sign, usually a sign that you can see, that it distinguishes one producer's goods from another producer's goods in the market. Recently, we have expanded that from simply things that you can see to smell marks. Some countries recognize a smell mark. If you come up with a particular smell,
A recipe or something?
No. A smell
Any
that will
smell, aroma.
for example, if you make
Yeah,
clothes,
yes.
you're a fashion designer,
Right.
and you come up with an idea as to make the clothes have a particular smell.
No, okay. Now let me ask you this.
Yes.
Are we talking about any smell, or just a nice aroma?
Sure. Well, no. The important thing is that the smell must be able to distinguish your goods from another person's goods. So if you have this shirt and another person designs a shirt very similar to yours, but mine has my smell. So when you come to the store and you go up to the counter or the rack on which the thing is there, you can take the smell. You know that's Mark Mary's clothes one time, because that's Mark Mary's smell, and I can register that smell. I'm not sure if in Dominica here our office is ready to register smell marks, but there are also sound marks.
Yes.
You could register that as a smell as a mark,
But
which you would use in advertisement, etc.
Yeah, but let me ask, but the noise that you just made, this noise, particular noise,
that's a Nike.
Anybody can do that, right? No, Dr. James. I mean, isn't the noise you made that anybody has the ability to do that?
Yes,
right?
But if I use it.
Because the first person to say, well, this is what is my product, and comes up with the sound or the color or the shape or the smell or the sign of any kind, registers that, you get protection for that.
Okay, so as a commercial entity, right? I mean,
yes, as a commercial entity, you can register it, and of course there is you have to keep a registration going so that you could tell who comes first, who comes second, and so on. And you are protected if you're the first.
Okay, all right, okay. Commercially,
so,
okay. I
so you can actually go to, in some countries, they protect the intellectual property office and register a smell. And that smell identity, you have to say what product and so on you're associating your smell with. So it might be clothes, it might be cars, it might be whatever.
Okay, but apart from copyright, right? And
that is trademark,
and
right?
Trademark, eh?
Many others.
For example,
patents,
which
protect inventions,
right?
Geographical indications, which protect the goods that are produced in a particular place, because the place itself, the literal ground, especially for agricultural products, have particular characteristics, and the people who do that have the skill to do that. For example, if you buy a high quality watch, which watch would it be? Highest quality watch?
The Swiss
watch. You know that already, right? Right. So if you go and you buy a Swiss watch, you will actually see the Swiss flag on the watch. That's a geographical indication. But the watch
actually, I have one right here.
Right, but exactly. But there's also a manufacturer's name on the watch.
Right.
That is manufacturer's trademark.
Right.
So all makers of watches in Switzerland can put the flag, but they then have their own individual brand of Swiss watch.
Right.
Yeah.
I suppose
So,
Rolex
yeah.
is still at the top, right?
Yeah, and then I suppose in terms of geographical indications, the one that's most well known is Champagne, to be precise, which says that you can only call your wine bubbling wine and so on champagne if the grapes are grown in that place, the area of France. That's called Champagne. If it's grown there and it's produced in the traditional champagne method, right? And
So we talked about
and therefore you pay a lot of money for champagne rather than vermouth.
so we talked about copyright, trademark,
That is geographical indication.
patent. Anything else?
Industrial design protects the shape and form of objects. Okay, but it generally implies that you're going to make large volumes of that thing in a factory kind of setting. However, you can also get a copyright protection for a thing for its shape and form. If you're going to do it or in a more...
Give me an example of an item that
like
could,
jewelry.
Jewelry, okay.
Yeah, jewelry. You
Right.
can, it's protectable by copyright. Yeah. Whereas
Alright.
industrial design will protect like the shape of a car, etc. A chair, because all of we have chairs all over the place. There are all kinds of different chairs with different shapes and form. Some people like them because of the shape and form of the chair.
Okay.
But they also have the purpose, same purpose.
So how, do you want to add anything to this, Dr. James?
Mark's doing a good job of covering the range of things. The thing with the industrial designs that might be attractive to the ordinary citizen is that whenever you're doing anything like handicraft and so on, and you're giving the thing an ornamental, a certain kind of appearance, we are very handicraft-oriented kind of a region. And we do things with our own lines, our own colors, our own shapes, our own novel materials from our environment and so on. All of those things can be protected for a period, not for very long, usually up to like 15 years, and you have to register and so on. But Mac is on track. It's a range of ways of expressing your creativity, and you have a variety of options for protecting them. Sometimes they even overlap, so he's on track there.
Intellectual properties we're talking about there. In this year, for all the other properties, you can consider them to be privileges which the state gives to you if you do certain things, which means they cannot give it to you at some point in time if they think you didn't do the right thing. Whereas copyright is a right that derives solely from the fact of creating the work. So you don't have to register it anywhere. As soon as you've created it, you own the copyright in it. Okay. Some countries say as soon as it's fixed in material form. Dominican Trinidad says as soon as it's created. So it doesn't have to be fixed before it's created.
Who says as soon as it is fixed? I missed that.
Like United States, St. Lucia, Antigua, etc.
But what happens in a case where somebody challenges you, on something that you claim to have created?
Copyright,
and it ends, created, and they have copyright too, and it ends up in court. Well, what do you have to do to prove? Since you say that you don't need to register,
yeah, sure.
Once you've created it, it belongs to you. So if this ends, and somebody else comes along and says, "But I created that," and it ends up in court.
Two things, two situations. One, where the case itself is about who created it. Okay, in that case, we would have to each of us bring evidence to prove what we are saying. For example, if mine existed before yours, I could not have copied yours. Okay, so copying would be done by you. However, the law also makes provision and says that it's only copying that is unauthorized. Being the same does not mean I copied it. So if you want to say I copied it, then you have to bring some evidence to show that I had opportunity to copy it, etc., etc. Which is why in the music business, for example, the music producers say, don't send me any demos unless I ask you for it. And they won't accept demos except from trusted people in the business who know the rules. Because if you send me a demo out of the blue sky, one of my employees or one of my artists might play it and hear it and says, oh, not too bad. And he might not actually remember it and copy it deliberately, but 3 years later, he makes a song that sounds pretty much like the one you sent me. And then you'll say, well, you copied my thing because on this day I sent it to you. So that is how you had it and you copied it.
Right.
Yeah. There's a second situation where it's not a question of it's you or me who created it. In that situation, in a civil court, the law says the person whose name appears in the usual place on the work is to be presumed by the court to be the author of the work.
On the usual, what is the usual place?
Well, you know books?
Yeah.
Usually there's a title, and then there's a name next to the title. So that's the usual place.
But if it's a song?
If it's a song, the same thing. There's a name next to the title at the back of, well, you need to have records at the back of the record.
No, I'm talking about the original song. You may have,
that's what I'm saying.
There's
a song.
Yeah.
I'm on suffering.
Yeah.
Ophelia sings it.
Right.
Ophelia didn't write it.
Right.
There's a name next to it, Clayton Geist. The law says you are to be to presume that Clayton Geist is the author of the song. And if you don't want to go along with that, then you must prove that he is not the author.
And I guess this is the question I'm really asking.
Right.
How does one prove, originally, because you may write a song and not attach your name, affix your name to the original lyrics.
Precisely.
You may put it somewhere and forget about it.
Point of fact, there was a case, Bob Marley. Okay? 3 o'clock roadblock. And his bass player made a lawsuit in the United Kingdom claiming that he was to be considered a composer of that song, or at least a co-composer with Bob Marley. Bob Marley had died already. So that song had actually been put on his name with ASCAP for reasons which will not detain us here. But in the case that was heard in the United Kingdom, the defendants brought evidence to say Bob Marley was the creator of the song, not you.
Yes.
And they said that happened when they would drive in somewhere in Jamaica just in the early 80s, end of the 70s into the 80s, and they were stopped at a roadblock. And Bob Marley started singing after they let them go, 3 o'clock roadblock. If you remember, the song also has a phrase about I had no birth certificate on me and so on and so forth. And that's when Bob Marley created the song, and then they recorded it later in the studio. Therefore, they proved to the court's satisfaction that the person who was claiming, or his name was next to it, was not the composer of the song.
Okay, well, I mean, it appeared that we took a detour, but I think this was necessary to have our readers understand, what we're talking about when we talk about a copyrighted material, or we talk about trademark or any other aspect of intellectual property.
You just made a linguistic error.
Copyrighted?
Copyrighted, which is a verb.
Okay, well, thank you.
I'll explain to you why you did it. You've heard it lots of times looking at American TV. Once upon a time, up in 1976 actually, you literally had to go to the copyright office and register your copyright. Otherwise, you could lose it if you put it out in public without registering it. So it was kind of correct to say copyright your work, but that's not in the United States. They've abandoned that.
You don't have to do that, right?
Right. Copyright exists in it
by the fact that you own it.
That it's created, yes.
Automatic copyright.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Dr. James, we finally got back to you because we're getting back on track now with regard to specifically what we're discussing. And that is, in the studies that you did, what were some of the activities, the industries that you were able to identify as having now existing in Caribbean economies, and also those with potential? In other words, what sort of industries are we talking about when we talk about copyright industries that are contributing and potentially can contribute to Caribbean economies?
A range of protected works, books, publishing activities. We measured that in all three sets of studies. Articles, pamphlets, anything, the newspapers and whatever they're doing. That's all a big part of it. Computer programs were not big in those days, but in the 2016 revisions, we picked up as much as we could of those. art, of course. We went to the art shops and the artists and considered whatever they were doing. We talked to the associations and found out, how important their work is, how much they're selling, and so on. The net income created from those things, painting, sculpture. A lot of what we did when we looked at the Eastern Caribbean, attempted to cover the architectural stuff. Architecture in the Eastern Caribbean, especially St. Kitts Nevis, brings in quite a bit of earnings. It's true across the region, including Jamaica too, but the place that I found most distinctive, maybe because of the way they're doing their Citizen by Investment program, is the outstanding contribution of architectural works. The photographers are not shabby. We measured their contribution directly. The epitome, of course, is music. Music, whether you're talking the lyrics or the sound, stage productions, all those. And theater, we measured that. We provided an estimate of the share of each of these inside the overall pool of outputs that we are calling copyright protected outputs: film, video, documentaries, and so on. All of these are important expressions. Nowadays, video games provide a lot of scope for copyright protected works, and Caribbean societies need to look at all of these features. There's a set of people living in these countries that really are skill-oriented people. Let me use that language. The musicians don't go to university to learn to play music. They just practice day and night, learning by doing, the artists and so on. And we need to pay a lot of attention to the fact that our people are a kind of special expression of the fact that most human learning comes from practice. So, we should not underestimate the value of moving beyond the events like the Creole Festival and so on into the video games that could come from them, the animations that could come from them, the films, the documentaries. When George Bailey and Ivan McWilliams and those people were doing mass, you see, in Trinidad and Tobago, what they were doing is really doing documentaries, wonders of Africa, the great heroes of the Zulus, and they were really creating documentaries in the form of a work of mass. And we nowadays have richer options than they did, because we could supplement those things with multiple angles of film and then create animated works and so on, all of which are still going to be very unique to our culture and could open real doors to the development of our people. We simply have not paid adequate attention to them, but we've covered the entire spectrum of possibilities in all our studies.
When we did the study for the OECS, we measured the contribution that DNO made to the economy of Dominica.
So how come you guys never told me that?
No, because we did that before you owned it.
I see.
You remember when you owned it, important thing, people might pay attention there. Right. You paid, a good sum of money for it.
Right.
What did you get?
I mean,
what did the previous owner give you? A piece of paper with some numbers written on it?
Yeah. The most important part of that was the goodwill, I suppose.
He didn't give you any chairs, any computers or anything. He gave you a piece of paper with some codes on it. He was giving you access to what had been there already. So that, you notice, has no physical form. DNO has no physical form, but it had value for which you paid money and which you are deriving revenue from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So when we would be measuring these things, we would be measuring what DNO is producing and its value.
Yeah, I wanted to ask now as a follow-up to what Dr. James said, and the both of you can weigh in on this. Having identified, you said you covered the whole spectrum of copyright business, so to speak, the Caribbean. But what, if you were to recommend, right, say, to the governments of those countries or any other country in the Caribbean, areas that can be potentially successful?
Both of them are important, but I think if I am to identify where we have underutilized potential, I think it would be mainly in the area of animation with the modern computer technology, machine learning, and so on. We have such a rich cultural foundation that we could do all sorts of clever animations with that would attract the attention of the world. And related to that, film and video game production. It doesn't have to be 3-hour films, you know. It could be clever documentaries. We have such a rich historical heritage, historical works all over the space. We have a basis for video games that are not shoot-up games. The human body is much more attractive than gun shooting down people. So if we were to pay attention to the off takes in the form of what multiple angle photography could deliver to the computer programmers who could then do the animation works and produce interesting documentaries, videos, video games, films, and so on. I think that's the underutilized potential that we are sitting on and can make a lot of money from. But all of them are important. And nowadays, my son was telling me he's a intellectual property lawyer, and he was telling me that nowadays what they're doing is that the musicians themselves are producing avatars who are musicians in order to deploy the power of AI. So the musician who would normally make the music by playing chords and scales and so on is now using AI with the avatar to do that, registering if necessary sometimes that, and then marketing that and making a lot of money with it because the online space is so big and so rich. So I think we have a lot of potential here to apply modern technologies that we have not really turned to and paid a lot of attention to. And the other aspect of that answer is that there is a lot of room for us to clean up our schooling system around these creative industries. The creative industries are skill-intensive industries. We have wasted decades focused on producing people like Mac and myself who could make limited income from learning academic stuff. The real money in the global economy, and I can tell you that as an economist, the real money in the global economy is in the skill applications, medicine, law. We used to pay attention to those long ago, but now you see what the programmers are doing, right? The applications, well, music is clearly a case of that, art, you know. So when we study what we're doing carefully, we could turn our school system into skill-intensive centers rather than simply academic centers. So you learn about things when you're doing academics, but when you're doing skill-intensive education, you're learning to do things, and that's where the majority of human learning comes from. I think that opens a huge door if we were to pay attention to how the creative industries really generate the value they create. And that's one of the things I've observed in my career about these industries here. We need to exploit the skill component of all of the things we have listed much more than we have so far.
You know, Mark, you have advocated, I remember, for coding. Coding.
For children to learn to write computer code.
Curriculum, right?
Yeah. For a long while.
So maybe that's something you would like to add to, you know, this.
Yes. I want to add to that because in Sweden, there are two subjects that everybody study up till high school. It's music and computer programming. Yes? With the result that Sweden produces lots of songs. And a lot of the songs that are sung by American stars, and so like Rihanna and so on there, actually done by Swedes. Because they have the musical knowledge and they have the technical knowledge from the use of the computer to write the programs to create the songs. So they work in the background. They're not up at the front, except, They had a famous group, ABBA, which, well, they're no longer performing, but their songs are still generating millions of dollars, okay? And I know Sweden is one of the countries that gets a steady inflow of revenue from copyright use of their songs abroad. Okay, although it's a relatively small country, but it makes as much money in copyright fees as the United States. And that's coming from outside into Sweden. And these are the people who are, doing it. So what Vanus is saying is indeed correct, that we have to scale up quickly. I mean, we're almost too late because now AI is doing so many things that a programmer would do. But now we have to scale up quickly so that we become very skilled programmers, right? So that AI doesn't displace us. We will work with the AI to create more value.
Just want to go back to Dr. James's point that he was identifying the various areas of copyright,
Sure.
activities, business activities that we could get into, and some he says that where the potential is underutilized.
Yeah, sure.
We've not fully explored the potential. Talk about animation, documentary making, and so on, those kinds of things. What I'm wondering, they do those things in other parts of the world, So what it is in the Caribbean that would give us, if you will, an advantage to be able to compete if we went into those areas?
The thing that we sit on in the Caribbean, equivalent to what you see in the Mediterranean, is a space in the global geography where people really find attractive to be in. People from all over the world want to come here. What we have done so far is to bring them here to go to the beach. But we could bring them for other reasons. We could bring them to participate in skill-intensive education, for example. So with all this talent we have in the region, why don't we have the best music schools, for example? So you could say to the Swedes, come to Dominica and go to music school. Just like we once said, come to Dominica and go to medical school. You could bring people up into the Caribbean space writ large, all across the Caribbean, because of the accommodating nature of our culture, safe, healthy, happy environments. We could say to people, look, you're under stress in America. Come to the Caribbean, you get a safe environment, family-friendly, healthy. Your lifestyle will add another 10, 15 years to your life, and so on. Go to school, and nowadays with modern technology, you're even welcome to stay, be a citizen, and earn from here. These potentials hang on us understanding the importance of building out our education system beyond the academic education into the skill-intensive tracks. You're not going to be able to, you couldn't tell anybody to come to Dominica to do medical school until you offered medical curricula. And the same would be true for the music. You get people to come, you say, Berkeley, come and team up with us in Dominica and let's set up a music school. Because we have so much beauty for people to enjoy. They could go to school, and when in the evening, the beach is right there, right? Especially if you're talking about up on our north coast and so on. So you are able to turn the skill component. Creative industries are skill-intensive industries. You're able to turn those into attractors for long-stay people. Remember what long-stay tourism does for you. It quadruples your population. You demand, if the population of Dominica is trending downwards, long-stay tourism will multiply that by 8, and therefore the demand that you're creating for the local output and so on will skyrocket. And that's the big thing we are sitting on that we are not utilizing when we fail to do skill-intensive education and say to the world, you could come here. Primary, secondary, tertiary, especially tertiary, and go to school and enjoy your life at the same time, meaning not breeze, but be living in a safe, healthy, crime-free environment. And so we could market all of those things if we are smart and understand how to transform the education system that we have to take account of the fact that we are a genuine talent hub in the global space.
Would you say that Ross University was a good example of that?
Good enough. Not perfect, but good enough. I mean, what Ross was doing was a part of the answer. We're not talking about simply cut and paste kind of industries, you know. You're also talking about collaborations with the world so that the investors are coming to your space in an empowered environment. Your communities are empowered to be entrepreneurs and so on. So the North Coast communities were catching on and beginning to offer housing supplies to students coming in, and they could have offered a lot more than that had they been empowered to encourage Russ to team up with them in a certain kind of way. But if they are empowered, they wouldn't just go to Russ, they would go to Columbia Medical School and other places like that, just kind of like what St. Kitts is trying to do, you know, giving room for Nevis to participate in the process and so on. So there is a sense in which we have to sit down and think through the model, the business model, more carefully than we have. But the principle that Ross represented was the principle of teaming up with the world to put the training program in place. Now, you could give that a broad meaning. Ross was just one variant of that. St. George's University, one variant of that. What St. Kitts Nevis is doing, one variant of that. But there are other variants, and those variants would be even richer if we were bringing our own cultural, creative industries to bear on the offerings that let me give you a quick example. Think about Laventille in Trinidad, an empowered community.
Yes.
Right? The greatest music school in the world would be in Laventille with Pan as their specialization. Right? I knew a lot of the musicians there, Bertie Marshall and those people there. They would have created a music university equivalent or better than Berkeley in Boston. And they could have said to Berkeley, you bring the horns, you bring the guitar, we'll add pan, and we'll create a kind of university here the world has never seen before. But because we don't pay any attention to proper education in music,
and Dr. James,
then we lose the opportunity.
Right.
For the benefit of the viewers who are not familiar with Laventille in Trinidad, tell us why you chose Laventille as an example.
Where pan was invented, that's where Highlanders with Bertie Marshall and them fellas invented many forms of the pan that we know and sell around the world today. That's where Desperados came from. All Stars is at the foot of the hill. You know, Tokyo is on another corner. Many of the great bands the world knows from Trinidad and Tobago came from just that one narrow environment and on its outskirts. They are a musical hub within the country. And they would have turned Laventille into a music university rather than a crime den, had they been empowered to take the steps required to make money for the community. They would not do it just for fun. They would do it to make money. And that's the key that is missing, to turn the culture into real money spinners. Steel bands should be schools, not just expressions of culture. They should be schools, and that's how they would really make money. And we are missing out on all of those possibilities by simply running the societies in this manner that we are doing, in which our people are not empowered, our communities are not empowered. So everything is tied to what the central government could think about, limiting the potential of the societies to develop really.
Yes.
Dr. James mentioned the school. Many people might not have heard what he said. Berkeley.
Yes.
There are
California.
two Berkeleys in America. One is Berklee, School of Music, which is in Boston, and then there's Berkeley University, University of California in California. But in point of fact, Gordon, you know Gordon Henderson.
Hey, if I know Gordon.
Oh, everybody knows Gordon Henderson. We were talking one day and he tells me, there's this guy who's a professor at Berkeley who was talking about that they wanted to establish a branch of Berkeley somewhere in the Caribbean. and he was wondering to go out loud whether Dominica would be interested in a thing like that. To which Gordon says, well, yes, but then you'd have to talk with the authorities and see how that would work. Well, I haven't found out from him whether he did speak to anybody, but obviously that hasn't happened. But in terms of what we're talking about, the use of the culture to generate income and employment for the people, and tying it with education, that would be an excellent example of having it there. We would have a top-rate music school, which we ourselves could attend, and foreigners would be coming here to Dominica. So we'll have a tourism impact, a cultural impact, and a modernization impact on the society.
An important point to add to what Mac is saying there is, if you have empowered communities, you see what our people have done with these cultural industries, with music and all of these expressions, literature, in the form of Derek Walcott and all of these kinds of people. They did these things living in the communities. And if the communities were empowered, the same thing that the individuals have done, the communities would do to make money. And we can't forget that. We're not sick. We're not different to any other people in the world. Our communities would be entrepreneurial communities, doing what the state has tried to do for decades around the region and failed because of the way the state is set up. Communities, as you know, are inclusive, sharing information, everybody learning from one another. There would be explosions of money making if we were to liberate them.
Okay, so we've established so far, gentlemen, that cultural industries based on Dr. James's studies, Trinidad and Tobago and the OECS and previously Jamaica, are in fact contributing, significantly to Caribbean economies, and even more so, there is greater potential, for those industries to contribute,
more,
even more. Okay, so we've established that. Now, you did a specific study on the World Creole Music Festival in 2016, simply to find out how it is contributing to the economy's value for money. It was called.
Right.
So, based on what has been established in the program so far, what Dr. James has said, and you chipped in, how do you apply that, to the study
one
that
event.
you did?
So basically, what you're trying to do is to establish to what extent the money expended by the authorities to make the event happen, what impact it had on the economy. Okay, back to the same studies we did there. When we do this study, we take all activities into account. For example, transportation, is one of those activities that cannot take, where a festival, for example, cannot take place without transportation. So part of the income that's generated from transportation is due to the festival. So that's basically what we're trying to do. So in the case of the World Creole Music Festival of 2016, we took the expenditure which the government made on the festival and related that to the impact that the spending of the festival goers had on the economy. So we first identified how many people came for the festival as distinct from being here at the time of the festival. Okay, then we figured out how much money they spent every day and how many days they spent here. And we multiplied that up and we got a total initial impact on the economy from that. Then for employment, we then looked at the number of people who were employed. For example, musicians who are employed to perform, this technical crew who are doing that, the dancers, the people who make costumes, etc. And then we know how much revenue came into the economy because of the festival. And then we relate that to the expenditure which the government made. And we found, unfortunately, that there was a misunderstanding of the relationship between the amount of expenditure you make and the revenue that you collect. Okay, it's not a linear relationship, meaning that if in 2014 or 2015 or 2011 you made $9 for every dollar you spent, but you only spent $500,000. Okay, and you made $9 on that for every dollar you made. So you make 500 times or 5,000 times 9. However, that doesn't mean if you then spend $1 million, you're going to make 9 times 1 million. Okay? And I think we made a bit of an error there, and we expended a lot too much money in 2016 relative to what we did before. In 2014, just the last year for which we had a festival before. So that the return on the dollar was actually $4.68 of impact on the economy relative to for each dollar that was spent. And that happened because we spent too much money. Because there was a misunderstanding about the relationship between the expenditure and the impact. Because if it were a continuously linear relationship, then the ideal thing to do would have been to borrow all the money there is in the world and spend it on the festival, and you would have 9 times all the money there is in the world,
right,
which is a sum of money too big for my head to calculate, yeah? But it's not a linear relationship. So you still have to pay attention when you're doing the festival to spend wisely. Okay? And don't just simply spend and say, because we're spending and there are impacts that are system-wide, that it will remain at $9 for each dollar that is spent. That's incorrect. And it showed that it was incorrect. If we had spent half the money that we spent, which we could have spent, we would have had about $9 for each dollar we spent. So the return on the dollar would have been higher.
Okay, so in a case
so essentially, we spent some money uselessly that didn't bring any benefit.
in making if the DDA, the Festivals Commission, your committee,
Right.
was on the DDA, right? Because it's basically the same organization, yeah. Were to decide now that we want to bring in, more participants, more visitors, more patrons to the festival. Then how should they go about doing that? What factors should they consider in deciding, how much to spend and what else to do to bring in the increased participation?
Well, just like any business, you would estimate how many people will be your customers. Okay? So if your customer base, you're expecting to have about, let's say, 4,000 persons come from abroad to the event, then you then go on and estimate how much money you need to spend to get them here. And you try to spend the smallest amount, okay? So that the expenditure that they make will have a bigger bang for the buck that you spent. Yes, because after a certain while, spending more money doesn't make more people come, nor does it make more people spend more money while they're here. It's what the principle of what they call in economics, diminishing marginal returns. After a certain point, your expenditure doesn't bring any more benefit. In fact, it might then start bringing negative benefits.
So, in other words, an understanding of your market is important in that.
Yeah.
The market that you're actually tackling and can actually reach.
And in our particular case, there are two important variables. One is the capacity to bring a certain number of people into Dominica. There's a limited capacity, airplane and boats and so on.
Right.
Secondly, there's a limited capacity to receive people. For example, I don't think we can receive 20,000 tourists here at one time who are living in some kind of building
and so on.
Right? We would have the accommodation even if you extended that to private homes and so on and so forth. To have 20,000 people housed in Dominica for over the 3 days.
Right. So in other words, you're saying that no matter what our what our intention is, what
Yeah.
what our
They
goals
are-
our plans, not
Right.
plans, but what we perceive, right?
Right.
That we'd like to see happen with the festival. We have to base that on reality.
Right.
In terms
And
of,
there are constraints.
Right. There are constraints.
Right. So you must identify the constraints and know where they are, and then we can know how much money we should spend
Right.
so that we get the maximum benefit.
Right. And but
Otherwise, it's kind of pretty easy to overspend. Okay? Yeah.
And part of that too is knowing what the or capacity, what we can accommodate.
Yeah. Which is
the
sort of
maximum number
thing.
of people we're going
The
to
sort of
accommodate.
thing we ought to know. We have
Right.
so many rooms available. Can probably get 10% more from private people who have empty apartments that they make available for the weekend, etc., etc.
So do you think then the organizers were overshooting those that
Yeah, I think
capacity?
I think they did. Yeah.
Okay. No. Very quickly, Mark, you also mentioned continued state financing. I think what was derived from the report that continued state financing, it has to be,
Right, that the state should
an
continue to
an
finance
ongoing
it.
factor, in the thing, right?
Well, the reason that is so is because lots of the benefits from the festival don't come directly to the person who is organizing the festival. A lot of the benefits are what known in economics as externalities. Okay, so hotels get business, taxi drivers get business, etc., etc., etc. All these are benefits that are coming into the country. However, if it were privatized, if you and I were the one putting up the festival, we have to make a profit from the money that's paid to get into the festival. So therefore, we will not spend beyond what the revenue at the gate will generate. Otherwise, we'll be making a loss. Unless the government, of course, guarantees us that they will subsidize whatever loss we make, which then comes back to the point, well, the government can simply do it itself because it's going to subsidize the loss anyway. Yeah?
Right. Okay.
Right. And then the other thing, of course, I think I gave the example of a private event that was organized in the Bahamas. A big festival, whatever its title was, that was organized by American entrepreneurs who promised the client, the heaven on earth virtually, and the thing was quite a failure. And because it was held in the Bahamas, the negative fallout from that spilled over onto the tourism business in the Bahamas, and the tourist board had to take steps to, manage the damage to their image.
But do you ever see a time when the
Creole Music
Festival will become self-sustaining?
Without
having government.
Yes,
Subvention.
it can.
And what would we have to do to?
How would I have to do that? One thing, you'd have to get a lot more commercial sponsors who would put up substantial amounts of money to add to the revenue. Yeah. And you'd have to look for these sponsors and convince them to come on board. And secondly, of course, you'd have to be paying attention to not paying more money for things than you ought to pay. For example, you'd have to limit, for example, the amount of artists and their fees, especially foreign artists. Bearing in mind, it's a very important thing. Vanus knows that. We study all of that in economics. They're about open economies and so on, dependent economies. The fact that we have small multipliers across all sectors in our economy there is due to the fact that we have what they call a high leakage. So that the money that's spent by the first person who spends it doesn't make 20 wrongs in our economy. It makes maybe 2 wrongs. Okay? So the person spends, like for example, he takes a taxi. He pays the taxi driver takes the money, he buys a loaf of bread. Well, where did the flour come from to make the bread? The flour came from abroad. Most of the money for the bread is for the flour. Out the money goes. So the rest of the money that circulates around is small So therefore, when you're doing things like the World Creole Music Festival, you have to bear that in mind, that you have to import certain number of facilities and service providers. But you have to make sure you don't overdo it and neglect and building up capacity in the country to provide these services, so that you rely as little as possible on importing things that are producible within the economy, which will have a bigger impact within our own society.
Okay, I have a couple of quick fire questions for you before we get back to Dr. James to kind of round up on the general topic. One, contractual improvements. Reading the document, I sort of highlighted some things that that came out of it that need some attention, right?
Yeah.
Contractual improvements very quickly. Yes.
Well, the thing is, as we've said that you said at the beginning there's virtually nobody here who knows much about copyright at all, much less somebody who knows about music business contracts and music business practice, with the result that lots of the contractual documents and the contractual practices are outside of the norm of the world music business. Yes, and I had suggested in point of fact that we should get the specialist music business lawyer to advise and work with the organizer of the festival so that we have contracts that meet the standard that are required. Okay, and that are good, and everybody should make sure the contracts are good. Right. From a contractual point of view.
But when you say good, is in terms of...
let me see if I explain.
Right. Mm-hmm.
There are certain...
let's try to get through that, through the answers quickly, so we can get to...
There are certain legal requirements for a contract to exist. The basic three are offer, acceptance, and consideration. So you can't make a contract and say, give me something, give me this, give me that, you give me that, and then there is no consideration. It must have consideration, otherwise it's not a valid contract. I could sign it and then go to court and say this was not a contract.
I don't want to prolong this, but because we have others to get to, but when you say consideration for the artist,
consideration in law means there are two parties to a contract. Mm-hmm. One party gives something to the other party. The other party must give something back to the first party.
Right,
it doesn't have to be actually equal in value.
Right.
Because in some situations, it's kind of pretty difficult to measure the value of certain things. So but there must be consideration.
Okay, so would one be correct in saying that consideration in the case of an artist performing at WCMF, right, is that I pay the artist and he provides...
and he sings on the stage,
He performs.
So consideration is there.
That's the basic.
You offered him to perform, he accepted, and you offered consideration. That part of the contract is fully valid.
Right.
However, there are other rights which the performers have. One of them is the right to be filmed, to have his performance fixed by photograph, by video, or by audio.
Right.
Those rights, if you want to have them, must form a separate contract in which the conditions of a contract must exist, which is one being consideration. So you can't say to an artist, we would like to film you, blah, 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 and stop at that. You must say, we will film you, and we will get X, Y, Z as consideration.
All right.
Which might be money or some other valuable thing.
Okay, so I guess that's something you'd probably have to take up with the WCMF and those artists.
So which is why I'm saying we need to get a proper lawyer who understands these...
To ensure that those contracts are properly
that the
done.
contracts are internationally up to international standard.
Okay. Now, quickly, streaming monetization is another area that very quickly.
Well, this is the 2025.
Yes.
Therefore, streaming is a valuable source of revenue. So therefore, in the whole planning of all our events, including Carnival and so on, streaming should be part of the revenue stream we should be aiming at.
Right.
It shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be
an integral and important part of the entire exercise. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. VIP product development. You mentioned that as well.
VIP product development. Well, of course, you have VIP product development. Well, it depends what VIP is.
Right.
You decide what a VIP is. Okay, and what facilities the VIP gets that's different or better or more expensive than others.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then you price it vis-a-vis the number of people you expect to get and the price you think that the VIP target market you are aiming at
Better
will pay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And finally, trademark registration.
Yes.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
Important.
It's very important. Earlier this year, or is it last year, somebody in St. Vincent, a minister of some sort, says he's going to organize some Creole rhythms and rhyme or something because it's out there. But of course, the Creole word is the important word in there. Okay? And we should not allow anybody else, especially in the Caribbean, to be using Creole in the name of their festival. So, and the way to do that is to make sure it's registered in the right places. Yes, which might require us to sign in some international agreements, like the Madrid Convention and so on.
So I will want to make one final comment, and that is that you cannot develop these economies just on the cultural industries. You got to do the diversification program and create the conditions under which all max complaints about an event and its minimal multipliers and so on could be dealt with. You have to diversify the economy. You have to head off into the exportable education, exportable healthcare, financial services, and so on, to create the environment in which big spending in the creative industries could yield big returns.
Okay.
I have to run, but I'm glad that you brought me into your show.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for the opportunity to share with the Caribbean community.